Good afternoon. So I will walk you through this presentation of the short forthcoming report that we have prepared at the ILO on the wage in Africa, which subtitle is Recent Trends in Average Wage, Gender Pay Gap and Wage Disparities. So it's not online yet, but it will be soon, probably next week. So the report is a companion document of the ILO Global Wage Report, which is published every 2 years. The last one was published in December with the main topic on the gender pay gap. And the report has two parts. The first one depicts the evolution of the average purchasing power of the wage, the real wages. And then we move to an overview of the existing wage disparities using microdata from 10 selected African countries with a focus on the gender pay gap. And the 10 selected African countries that we look at are Cape Verde, Egypt, Ethiopia, the Gambia, Madagascar, Malawi, Namibia, South Africa, Tanzania, and Tunisia. So it's mainly based on household survey. Most of them are labor force survey. And in the case of Egypt, we use the Egyptian labor market panel survey of 2018. So maybe before starting, it's good to have some stylized fact about wage employment in Africa, and especially mentioning the fact that wage employment in Africa is still limited. It's about 1 in 3 workers in the whole continent, and focusing on Northern Africa, it's 2 in 3 workers, a bit above the continental average. It's male-dominated status of employment, so because more than 1 in 3 wage employees are actually female, so it's 2 in 3 wage employees that are male, sorry. And 80% of the wage employees in Northern Africa are male employees. It's highly informal. On the whole Africa, according to the estimates that we had for 2016, almost 60% of the wage employees were informal, and it's a bit less in Northern Africa. Nearly half of the population of wage employees was informal, and the share of wage employees in employment is increasing slowly. It has increased by 4%, so over the last decade between 2006 and 2017, 4 percentage points. So now I will just have a quick overview. I will just make a quick overview of the trends in real wage, trends in the purchasing power of the wages, because I want to focus more on the wage inequalities and the gender pay gap, because it is this part of the report is based on the data from the Egyptian labor market panel survey for Egypt. So concerning the trends in real wage, they have been growing over the past. They grew over the past decade between 2006 and 2017 by 20% for the whole Africa. It was this growth was sustained by productivity gains. The increase in productivity over the same period was 17% for the whole Africa. The increase in real average wage have been a bit steeper for Northern Africa. However, because in Northern Africa it has the wages grew by 22%. However, in the over the recent period from 2014, we can see a decrease in the real average wage. They have decreased by 5% between 2014 and 2017 in the whole Africa. And the increase was a bit steeper in Northern Africa, especially in 2017, due to the evolution observed in some countries, including Egypt, with high inflation during year 2017. But in sub-Saharan Africa, the real wage have also decreased between 2014 and 2017, especially due to the situation, the evolution of the wage observed in countries such as Nigeria, which weigh a lot in terms of population in the sub-regional average. So now I will move to an overview of the wage disparities in the 10 selected countries, because the trends in average wage are important to see the evolution of the purchasing power of the wage over the years, but they don't give any indication of the way the wage are distributed within countries. So having an assessment of wage disparities is important, and we start with an assessment of the overall wage inequalities. And for that, the figure that you have on the slide gives you the ratio of the needs decile of the wage, which is the wage of the top wage earner. And the wage of the top wage earner, this ninth decile is the ratio is done over the first decile of the wage, which corresponds to the wage of the lowest wage earner. So it gives you an extent of the wage ladder within the country, the distance between the bottom wage and the highest wage. And we see that according to this measure, the wage disparities are higher in the southern part of Africa, according to the data we have on South Africa, and in Namibia, we see that in these two countries, the top wage earners earn more than 20%, and the lowest wage earners. And for instance, in countries from Northern Africa, such as Egypt and Tunisia, the wage disparity is much smaller, with the top wage earner earning around 5 times the wage of the lowest wage earners. And this is consistent if you use other measure of wage disparities, such as the Gini coefficient of the wage. You will have more or less the same ranking. Concerning, there is, in terms of wage disparities, there is one which is at interest for communities and policymakers. It's the difference in pay between men and women. And to remind you that there are several instruments that tackle this issue. There are several international instruments. First, almost all African countries have ratified ILO Convention 100, which is an equal remuneration convention, equal pay for work of equal value. It's also in the Millennium Agenda, the UN Millennium Agenda, and it's also included in the Sustainable Development Goal 8, with target 8.5, which aims at achieving equal pay for work of equal value by 2030. More on the African agenda, the topic of difference in pay between men and women is also included in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights and the Rights of Women in Africa, which was adopted in 2003, which is also known as the Maputo Protocol, which aims at which calls a country to promote national law and judicial system aiming at achieving and protecting wage equality. And more recently, the African Union Strategy for Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment, that was adopted in Nouakchott last year, in 2018, included the implementation of the Maputo Protocol.
7 minutes.
Okay. So in terms of gender pay gap, how do we measure it? The most common measurement of the gender pay gap is just looking at the difference between the average of men's and women's pay relative to the average pay of men, which is called generally the raw gender pay gap, because we don't do any correction. We just compare the average pay of male employees to the average pay of female employees. And for the 10 selected countries that we studied, you have the chart. So in a number of countries, actually in most of the countries, 6 of them, you have a positive gender pay gap. But actually in some countries, 3 of them you can see a negative gender pay gap in Cape Verde, Namibia, and Tunisia, which means that on average, female employees are better paid than male employees. And for Egypt in 2018, according to the estimates that we have done, it was 0, close to 0. But these results actually partly reflect a difference in the structure of male and female wage employment. And actually, if you look at the composition of wage employment for female and you compare it to the composition of male employment across the 10 countries that you have, you will find some characteristic of female wage employment that can affect, in the end, the gender pay gap. For instance, I summarize, you have the tables, you will see the tables in the report, but we can see the pattern that female wage employees appear to be often better endowed than their male counterpart in terms of education levels. In the majority of countries that we have, female wage employees work more often in the public sector than male employees. Female employees also appear to be rather polarized with regard to their occupation, as they often hold either unskilled or highly professional position. So all this very specific structure of wage employment can also affect the estimate of the raw gender pay gap. So this is why fine-tuning the analysis and looking at the gender pay gap according to various individual unemployment characteristics is important to have a better diagnostic. So that's what we have done. We have computed the gender pay gap according to a selection of individual unemployment characteristic of wage earner. So I take the example of Egypt, but we have done that for all the countries that we had. I just here look at the age, the education level, the sector, in terms of private or public sector, the occupational level, and the wage level. The position of the wage ladder, and you can see that below, for instance, if you consider the age below the age of 40, there is a positive gender pay gap of around 10%, but it's not the case. If you look at higher age, the gender pay gap is negative, meaning that on average, women are better paid at these age levels. If you look at the education level, you will find a very important gender pay gap for women that are below high school, and for higher education levels, the gender pay gap is almost close to 0. If you compare the public and the private sector, you will find an important. It was mentioned earlier, but we will find an important gender pay gap in the private sector, more than 20%, whereas in the public sector it's very small. At occupational level, you have a gender pay gap at almost all educational level, but not for the managers, where women among managers seem to be better paid than their male counterpart. And if you look at the wage level, so if you look at the gender pay gap at the first decile of the wage, which is among the population that is the least paid, the population of wage employees, you have a very important gender pay gap, more than 30%. And at the 9th decile, for the population which is the highest paid, the gender pay gap is almost 0. So given these elements, we have come to an alternative measure of the gender pay gap, which we have called the factor-weighted gender pay gap. And in essence, this methodology is aimed at taking into account the difference in structure of employment between male and women. So in essence, the methodology groups female and male wage employees into more homogeneous subgroups. And then it estimates the gender pay gap within each subgroups. And then we do the average for each subgroups that we have. And so the 4 dimensions that are taken into account to form the subgroup are the education level, the age, the working time status, the private sector versus the public sector status. So for instance, for the first group, you will have people below high school, which are aged below 30, which work full-time and which work in the private sector. And for the second group, you will have just one characteristic that change, and so in the end you have a partition of your population of wage employees in 2 subgroups that are composed of employees that are comparable according to these characteristics. And what we obtain in the end with this correction is it's on the chart that you have on the wall. So you see that there is systematically a gender pay gap. If we do a correction, even in the countries where the gender pay gap the raw gender pay gap was negative, so gender pay gap without correction, now we see that there is a gender pay gap. So it's the case in Cape Verde, in Namibia, in Tunisia, in Tanzania, which had negative raw gender pay gap. In Egypt, you see that actually the gender pay gap with this measure is quite high, one of the highest in Africa. Still, it's less, not as high as in South Africa. So I will just as a conclusion, maybe the main conclusion is that beyond the raw gender pay gap, complementary analysis are necessary. This is maybe the main message of the paper, because the gender pay gap can be explained along discrimination in pay by several factors, such as segregal occupation, which means that female workers can't access some employment categories. So to be able to disentangle the various factors impacting the gender pay gap, you need complementary measures, such as the factor-weighted gender pay gap that we have implemented. But you may want to use more further advanced methodologies that enable to fine-tune the analysis of the gender pay gap. I can see that Mona has been a bit into this direction, at least separating finding an adjusted measure of the gender pay gap in the public and private sector separately. So yes, complementary analysis is necessary and not just sticking to the raw gender pay gap. Just we'll finish by just some of the policy tools that are useful to tackle gender pay gap. Of course, there are minimum wages, either statutory minimum wages or negotiated minimum wages. Especially this is an important tool, especially when the gender pay gap is important at the lower tail of the wage distribution, because implementing a minimum wage will tend to push up the wages of women that will, in the end, get wages that are closer to their male counterpart. You can also tackle the gender pay gap through collective bargainings. Of course, minimum wage that are negotiated through collective bargaining agreements, but also you can adopt collective bargaining agreements at the enterprise or sectoral level that include clauses aiming at specifically closing the gender pay gap, such as such as research within the companies, specific rates of wage for women, aiming at progressively closing the gender pay gap. So you have several arrangements that can be made through collective bargaining agreements. And just to mention, of course, all the legal environment conducing to the removal of barriers to women, especially on the labor market. So a number of countries have adopted laws that prohibit the discrimination in pay against women, of course. I also include in this category maybe the laws and the policies that aim at easing the conciliation between family life and personal life, because in the end it can, we mentioned it a bit yesterday, but in the end it can have an impact on the gender pay gap if, for instance, women are away from the labor market for an amount of time they will lose in terms of experience. In the end they will have lower wages. So I will finish my presentation here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.